Okay, hi everyone. My name is Alyssa Ayers and I'm Dean of the Elliott School here. Thank you for joining us for this first book launch of the year 2024. We're very excited about it. This book launch is presented by the Elliott School Book Launch Series, which we do, the Sigur Center for Asian Studies, and the GW School of Media and Public Affairs. And you will see why in one moment. And it's great to see so many friends and colleagues and affiliates here. Thanks to all of you who are also joining us online. So today we are thrilled to be launching the latest publication, the latest monograph from Professor Janet Steele, Malaysiakini and the Power of Independent Media in Malaysia. In a few moments, she'll be offering an in-depth book talk, and then we'll open things up to a Q&A for the rest of the session. But let me just say a few words both about Janet and her work. For those who do not know her, Professor Steele is Professor of Media and Public Affairs and International Affairs, and she is Interim Director of the Sigur Center for Asian Studies. She also writes books in the midst of all that she is doing. She is a leading expert in how culture is communicated through the mass media. She's been a regular visitor to Southeast Asia over decades. She's received multiple Fulbright teaching and research grants, and she's traveled across the region as a speaker specialist for the State Department. You will see from this book and from her earlier book about media in Indonesia that she's also had a front row seat over the decades observing the role of media in democracy and democratic transition in Indonesia and Malaysia. So this book, Malaysiakini, is her latest publication on journalism theory and practice. She's authored numerous articles on the subject in 3 other books. 2005's Wars Within, the Story of Tempo, an independent magazine in Suharto's Indonesia. 2014's Email dari Amerika, Email from America, and her book in 2018, Mediating Islam, Cosmopolitan Journalisms in Muslim Southeast Asia. So with this, her 4th book, Professor Steele offers what she calls a newsroom ethnography of Malaysia's sole independent media outlet, the online news portal Malaysiakini. And she chronicles very deftly Malaysiakini's history from its start in the wake of public protests following the firing of Malaysia's deputy prime minister in the late 1990s to its enduring success almost 30 years later. The director of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at Oxford, Rasmus Klein Nielsen, declared that everyone who cares about independent journalism can and should learn from Malaysiakini's example, and there is no better place to start than reading Janet Steele's book. So I think we will all agree and look forward to hearing more from our colleague and esteemed author, Professor Steele. The podium is yours, and congratulations again on the book. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks to all of you for coming. I'm really touched. I have friends here from college, from Indonesia. I think there may be some online friends from Indonesia, some State Department friends, some SMPA friends, some new colleagues from the Elliott School, and of course, my wonderful friends from the Sigur Center. So I am super grateful. This is just wonderful. You know, I'm going to talk about Malaysiakini, but I'm also going to try to put Malaysiakini into the broader context of some of the things I've learned about Southeast Asia from really the last 25 years of studying journalism there. I thought that might be of more interest, not only, oh my goodness, more colleagues from the State Department and people I ought to be thanking. I've got a little disrupted there. Carl and Judy, I'm so glad to see you. Carl with his new knee. These are diplomats from Indonesia, who I believe I thank in my acknowledgements. So I decided I would talk a little bit more about putting Malaysiakini in a slightly broader context of journalism in Southeast Asia and some of the things I've learned in the last 25 years. I'm actually going to start with Princess Diana. I had my first Fulbright to Indonesia, 1997 to 1998. And that's what changed my life. I'm so grateful to the Bureau of Education and Cultural Affairs at the State Department that oversees the Fulbright program, because I am totally a poster child for the Fulbright program. This Fulbright to Indonesia in 1997 to 98 changed my life. I was in my PhD is in US history. But my dissertation, and actually my first book, was on the New York Sun. So I always studied the history of journalism, but I had certainly not studied Indonesia until I had the Fulbright 1997 to 98. So I leave for the airport. I flew out of BWI on August 31st, 1997, the day that Princess Diana died. And so everywhere I went, it was a kind of circuitous route. I flew on Garuda for part of it, despite the Fly America. So I think I was in Minneapolis, and then I believe I was in at all the places I landed before I got to Indonesia. But everywhere I went, there was Princess Diana on television sets, and this was really the huge news of the day. So I get to Indonesia, and everybody tells me that I look exactly like her, which of course is not at all true. And so I show up at the University of Indonesia for my first day of teaching in the American Studies department, and they say, "Oh, we want you to give a lecture." And I said, "Sure, on what?" And they said, "Princess Diana." And I said, I really don't know anything about Princess Diana, but as my Indonesianist friends here know, you can't say no in Indonesia. That's really quite rude. So I quickly thought, and I said, well, maybe I can give a talk on media coverage of Princess Diana. And so I did, and it was a big success. And that's when I learned that a good professor really can lecture on just about anything given enough time. And so that was really my introduction to Indonesia. My real introduction to Indonesia was when I heard Gunawan Muhammad, the founding editor of Tempo magazine, which had been banned by Suharto in 1994. I heard him accept an award here in Washington, actually in Arlington. It was the Louis Lyons Award for Courage in Journalism. And I had heard of Tempo. I knew that this was publication like Time magazine that had been banned by Suharto. And I got to hear Gunawan speak. And I remember him saying, "I don't know why the army should fear us when they're the ones with the guns." And that made a really big impression on me. And so I go to Indonesia, and it seems like everybody I meet is an ex-Tempo journalist, including my good friend Bambang Herimurti, who was also a Fulbrighter. And so I was introduced to Bambang, who at that point, he was kind of the leader of the former Tempo journalists. They were all at a publication called Media Indonesia. They invite me to Media Indonesia. I go meet them, and they asked me if I could come and teach English. I said, "No, I'm not an English teacher." But I said, "I'm happy to come and talk about journalism once a week, and we can do it in English. This would be fun." And, I was thinking, well, here, these poor journalists, they're working under this terrible authoritarian regime. There's no press freedom. This will be very interesting. We will talk about press freedom. I will introduce them to good journalism. Well, I was so wrong. I was so wrong. The very first thing that I learned is that nobody has to teach journalists how to do good journalism. That no matter what authoritarian regime we're talking about, journalists understand what good journalism is. They may not be free to practice it, but they know what it is. So they certainly didn't need me to tell them what good journalism was, because they already knew. And I actually learned way more from them than they learned from me. Okay, so the other really important thing that I saw in Indonesia that I've carried with me this whole time was the importance of journalist associations, independent journalist associations. After Tempo was banned, the Alliance of Independent Journalists was founded. And I don't know if my friend Andreas Harsono is here with us online. I didn't get to see who is in the virtual group. But Andreas and a number of his friends organized this group, which featured all of the prominent editors of Indonesia from publications that had been banned, including Gunawan Muhammad, including Fikri Jufri, including Aristides Kotopo from Sinar Harapan. And so this powerhouse of these journalists, as Aristides Kotopo said, it was as if the regular army had joined the guerrillas. And they became so important. They were founded because the state-sanctioned Indonesian Journalists Association had stated that it could understand the banning of the three magazines. So, of course, these young people did not agree with that. And in fact, they set up this group, and they came out with the Sirnagali Declaration, which said, "We reject all kinds of interference, intimidation, censorship, and media bans which deny the freedom of speech and open access to information." So the second thing I learned is that journalists themselves have to fight for press freedom. Nobody else is going to do it. The politicians aren't going to do it. Civil society might do it, but they need the leadership of journalists themselves, because journalists are the ones who can explain press freedom is not something that just benefits us. It's for all of us. It's for everybody. And so the Alliance of Independent Journalists was so important. I'll fast forward in a bit to what happened in Malaysia, but there's no comparable organization in Malaysia. And I think that's a big difference between what's happened in Indonesia and what's happened in Malaysia, that in Indonesia, journalists themselves organized in this very powerful group. Well, I got a little bit ahead of myself. This is the Parliament building, and this is the beginning of Reformasi in Indonesia, when civil society, student activists, journalists toppled Suharto. And I love this photo. I don't have a credit for it. I'm not sure who took it. But May 28th, May 21st, 1998, Suharto is forced to resign. What's really interesting, the next day, journalists circulate a list of demands they consider essential to press freedom, the very next day. Less than 1 week later, the new Minister of Information, Muhammad Yunus Yosfia, meets with these journalists and agrees to all 10 of their demands, including that they would eliminate the 1984 regulation signed by the Minister of Information. As he said, I can't change the law. Parliament has to change the law, but I can eliminate the regulations. And this was because of the demands of journalists. It was journalists themselves who did this. So, and Tempo got its license back. And I had to, my Fulbright was over. I cried all the way home on the airplane. And then I realized, you know, there's nothing to prevent me from going back to Indonesia. And in fact, I probably shouldn't admit this while we have administrators around, but never having been too good at math, I thought when I applied for the Fulbright, I thought it was my sabbatical year, but I'd actually miscounted. So my dean at the time in the Columbian College said, well, you can have the Fulbright and you can have the sabbatical, but you have to come back and teach for a year in between. Great. So I did, and I came back, and my colleague Joel Kuipers, who was the great Indonesianist here, I studied with him. I learned Indonesian, and then I went back on sabbatical, and I wrote a book on Tempo magazine. While I was there, they passed a new press law, which again, and Carl, I guess, was there when they passed the new press law. In fact, Carl invited me back. There was a little bit of nepotism involved. One reason there are so many wonderful diplomats here is that, you know, you guys all know each other. And so it turned out I was a pretty good speaker about press freedom. And so when you would leave Indonesia and go elsewhere, like to Myanmar, or like to Malaysia, or like to, you know, wherever, I've got invited to a lot of different countries to speak. So I'm real grateful for that. Anyway.
It's networking.
Networking. Okay, networking. All right. So this press law was really, really important. And one little backstory here, the Minister of Information, the guy who eliminated all those regulations and invited UNESCO in to come help with the press law, Muhammad Yunus Yosfia. He was the army general who was responsible for the shooting of those 5 journalists in Balibo in East Timor. Everybody knows this. Habibie appointed him to be the Minister of Information. And you can't tell me that he didn't do this on purpose. I actually got to interview him shortly after he took the job. And I said to him, do you think President Habibie has any idea of what you're planning to do? And he just laughed and he said, no, he didn't know. Anyway, Muhammad Yunus Yosfia was a real hero. I mean, he perhaps was a good soldier and doing what he had to do in East Timor. And, you know, I, of course, didn't agree with that, but he certainly made up for it with inviting UNESCO and creating this press law that is still a model for the region. Instead of regulating journalists, it provides punishments and fines for those who interfere with the work of journalists. It's an incredible press law. And again, who was behind this? Well, journalists pressuring the government. So we've got the new press law, and this is a picture of the press council. This was one of the other really interesting things that happened. Indonesian journalists developed their own code of ethics. It's like an annex to the press law. And this is the next important thing I learned, that journalists should regulate themselves through their own professional practices. That I know in Malaysia, there's currently talk of a media council. But again, it's always, how much is the government going to be involved in this media council? if the government is involved, then it's not independent, right? The Indonesian Press Council, no, there's no government people involved at all. I think the government actually owns the building, but that's it. So it was a great story arc. Tempo was banned. Tempo gets its license back. Tempo comes back. Gunawan Muhammad, whose life was completely changed by the banning of Tempo, he goes from being basically a structural collaborator with the Suharto regime to being what one general called the most dangerous man in Indonesia because he was such a strong fighter for press freedom. So my book on Tempo is available for free. You can download it. Just Google me and my name and Wars Within, and you can download it for free. So that was a great story, great narrative arc. So Malaysiakini, my first visit to Malaysia, and this was in 2006. And again, I forget, Carl, you may have been in Malaysia. I'm not sure if that's why I got invited to Malaysia, but I got invited to Malaysia. And so I remember going there, and I remember my friend Yvonne O is not here yet. I know she's coming later. I think she had another meeting. She was the senior press specialist in the press section, in the public affairs section of the U.S. Embassy in Malaysia. And Yvonne has always been my angel in terms of getting me back to Malaysia. Well, this was the very first time. And she set up a whole bunch of talks at different places, different newspapers, different universities. I remember thinking, where are the activists? Where are the interesting young people? Because everybody seems kind of not that interesting. Well, I got my book on Tempo had been out, and I got invited to give a talk at an organization called Gerak Budaya. It's an organ, which means culture movement. It's a bookstore, it's a movement, and that's where the young activists were. And so I met a whole bunch of them, and then they invited me to come back, and I love this. I got invited back to the Strategic Information Research and Development Center, which was part of Gerak Budaya, and they asked me to give a talk on the role of investigative journalism in fighting corruption. Now, that's a great topic. However, how on earth can you do that in a country which, even though there is guaranteed freedom of speech, assembly, and association, there are a host of limitations on the press in Malaysia. First of all, the ownership, that every publication in Malaysia is connected somehow to either a political party or people who are cronies of the political party. But just look at a list of the laws affecting the media: Defamation, Communications and Multimedia Act, the Official Secrets Act, Sedition Act, the Security Offenses Act, which is the kind of new it's an act by which you can be put in jail if you have done anything that upsets the government. The Anti-Fake News Act, all of these things. So how can the role of investigative journalism in fighting corruption? Look at all the things that the way they can get you. I was so naive, I didn't realize that the Official Secrets Act meant that ordinary people in Malaysia don't know what's in the state budget until it's actually tabled in Parliament. They don't know because that's an official secret. So the role of investigative journalism in fighting corruption? Well, I actually ended up talking about the wonderful story that was published in the Washington Post about the Walter Reed Army Hospital and all the problems at the Walter Reed Army Hospital, which Ann Hull, and I forget the name of the other journalist, they won a Pulitzer Prize for it. Can't think of her name. Anyway, they wrote it all just by interviewing patients and their families. No official secrets. Just talk to ordinary people. So all of these, so I don't know how good the lecture was, but I got to meet Stephen and Prem, who I'll talk about in just a second. So these were the founders of Malaysiakini. They're on the cover. I'll talk about them in just a second. But I realized, I had just written this book on Tempo, the brave journalist fighting the authoritarian regime in Indonesia. And I thought, well, I can't just go ahead and write now a book about the brave journalists fighting the authoritarian regime in Malaysia. It's kind of like genre fiction. I can't do, or genre nonfiction. Can't do that. So I took a sort of detour and wrote about journalism and Islam. And this book was very hard to write. It took forever. But the question I was asking myself are the principles of journalism universal? And I argue that yes, they are, although the way we explain them to ourselves is based on our culture. So I looked at what I would arguably 4 basic principles of journalism: truth, balance, verification, independence from power. And then I interviewed journalists in 5 different countries, or excuse me, 5 different publications in 2 different countries, including Malaysia. And in Malaysia, I looked at Malaysiakini, and even there, I found, even though Malaysiakini it's secular. They don't like it if I use that word because they could get in trouble for being accused of being secular, but they are basically secular. Even journalists there would describe these principles in very similar language. I'll just give you one example quickly before I move on. This is verification. I found journalists, Muslim journalists in Indonesia and Malaysia, whether they work for Malaysiakini or whether they work for Haraka, which was the newspaper of the Islamist Party in Indonesia, whether they work for Tempo, which is majority Muslim, even though it's certainly not a confessional publication, they would all cite the same verse from the Quran in terms of explaining verification. And that is, "O believers, if an evildoer comes to you with some news, verify it, investigate to ascertain the truth, lest you should harm others unwittingly and then regret what you have done." And, just quickly, I bet if we were to go to the Washington Post and ask journalists to explain verification, they would not be quoting the Bible as a way of doing so. So this was my detour. But then, okay, that book's done. So now it's time to finish what really did become a kind of labor of love for me. This is the old Malaysiakini building, the one in Bangsar where I did most of my research. This is Stephen Gan, and this is Premesh Chandran. Stephen is Chinese Malaysian, Prem is Indian Malaysian. And I don't think that it's accidental that a Chinese Malaysian and an Indian Malaysian from a country in which constitutionally Malays have special rights and privileges would end up developing a publication that represents the kind of country they wanted to live in. And that's what they did. They met in Australia. Stephen is an interesting fellow. His father was an immigrant from China, a bus driver, a small hold rubber tapper. Stephen actually grew up in a new village. Those of you who know Malaysian history, this was where during the emergency after the end of the Second World War, when there was concern about Chinese communists in Malaysia, the policy was to round up all Chinese Malaysians and put them in fenced-in villages, the new villages. That's what they called them. The idea actually was taken from U.S. strategy in the war in Vietnam, American war in Vietnam. I don't think it worked very well there, and it also didn't work very well in Malaysia. But anyway, that's where Stephen ended up growing up. Prem came from a more solidly middle-class family, but his father had a government contract, which was then taken away when they decided that government contracts needed to go to Malay businesses. So both of them had, some difficulties growing up. So they meet in Australia. And I think this is quite significant. They were very involved in an overseas student organization in Malaysia. Stephen is a few years older than Prem. They weren't in the same class, but they did know each other. They were both involved in this group. And I believe that it was in Australia that they actually learned a kind of vocabulary for explaining what was going on in their country, that they learned about, racism. I mean, so they certainly had both faced it, but they really learned a vocabulary for understanding Malaysia. So, all right, so Stephen and Prem, Chinese Malaysian, Indian Malaysian, they meet in Australia, and they're very interested in media, even when they're quite young. And I think at a very young age, they really came up with a goal of creating a kind of news organization that would reflect the country that they would want to live in. So this is an interesting problem because, I had written this book on Tempo that had this wonderful story arc where, Tempo gets banned and the courageous journalists all fight the power, and then they end up getting license back and they have a new press law and everything is pretty good. Nothing like that happened in Malaysia. They just kept fighting and fighting and fighting, and it just seemed like nothing changes. There are these intractable problems of race, ethnicity, religion that never change. Well, when I'm teaching narrative journalism, which is one of my favorite classes to teach over in media and public affairs, I'm always telling my students that you need to take your weakness and make it your strength. That maybe this was the story. Maybe in Malaysia, nothing does change because despite changes in government, changes in politics, these problems of race, religion, ethnicity just never go away. So this is the next thing that I learned. So what I decided to do was to write in the book to focus on how Malaysiakini, as this news organization, actually deals with these intractable problems, because the problems aren't going anywhere. And they are a news organization that actually is made up of the three main races in Indonesia, the same main ethnic groups: Chinese Malaysians, Indian Malaysians, and Malays. How do they actually navigate these problems? So I have chapters on Stephen and Prem and their backgrounds, which are really quite interesting. I did them a disservice by racing through it so quickly. And then I start with what actually a number of Malaysian friends use this term, the Reformasi generation, this generation that was shaped by the firing of Anwar Ibrahim in 1998. You know, he was Mahathir's golden boy for years and years. And on the cover of my book, which was actually designed by the wonderful former design director of Tempo magazine, Malayla Mahagasari, we've got Mahathir and Anwar. And the story starts with Mahathir and Anwar and actually ends with Mahathir and Anwar. But so Anwar gets fired, and people are really mad because, like, why? Why did he get fired? And so this is a famous picture of Tian Chua, which I'm using with permission of the Star newspaper. And again, great thanks to my friend Zakia Koya, who helped me secure permission to use it as a local as opposed to a foreigner, because I saved a lot of money. And anyway, he is in front of a water tank. And the demonstrations protesting the firing of Anwar were really quite extraordinary. So Stephen and Prem were a little too old to be part of the Reformasi generation, but the journalists they hired were straight out of that cohort. So I have a chapter on the Reformasi generation. I have a chapter on the team, and one of the Stephen, when he was at university, he developed a whole kind of theory about how to run things, a completely flat organization where everybody, it was based on cooperatives where everybody joins in the decision making, and that still works at Malaysiakini to more or less well. And here's a bunch of the team all having lunch, I guess. And so I have a chapter on that, on how they actually the structure of Malaysiakini, how it's organized. I have a chapter on independence, which is a term, you know, it's funny. I was thinking about my career and things that I've been interested in really my entire career, starting back when I was an American historian. And it's what journalists mean when they talk about independence. And certainly back in the New York Sun in Charles Dana's day, for fans of the penny press and its aftermath, when he talked about being independent, he didn't mean he didn't have political views. He just meant he wasn't affiliated with a political party. When he ran the Sun, it was a Democratic newspaper, but it was not owned by a political party. Well, in Malaysia, being independent is an interesting term too. And Malaysiakini is independent in that it's now behind a paywall and it's paid for by subscription. Now, it's interesting, the Malay section is open for free. You can read everything there for free, but the English section is behind a paywall. At election time, they make their stories for free. They have received a fair bit of outside funding, but they are very tightly control what that funding can cover. One rumor that has dogged them persistently is that they are in the pocket of #1 demon in Malaysia, George Soros. I go on, I have a whole big section on what actually happened there. It turned out that George Soros's Open Society Initiative had funded the Southeast Asian Press Alliance, which gave a grant to Malaysiakini. And then George Soros himself apparently boasted to the Far Eastern Economic Review that he had brought democracy to all these countries, including Malaysia. He did say that, and it was not true. But boy, did it create a huge uproar, just a nightmare for Malaysiakini. And they have been incredibly transparent about this. But to this day, if you Google Malaysiakini and Soros, you will find all kinds of stuff about Soros and how he's secretly funding Malaysiakini in order to topple, whatever government is there. So Malaysiakini has been subject to a lot of attacks. This was one. This is paint that was thrown on their sign. It was they're quite brave. They've been raided by the police. Their computers have been seized. Ironically, whenever they're raided, that actually is pretty good for business, because then all the international people like us rally around and send money, send support. And I document all the times that things like that have happened. They have an important investor, the Media Development Loan Fund, which for anybody interested in why I suddenly decided to go to Serbia, it's a Media Development Loan Fund connection. That the Media Development Loan Fund was established by a Serbian journalist named Saša Vucinic, and their very first, well, maybe not their very first, one of their first clients was Malaysiakini, and they invest in Malaysiakini. So I knew that there was a very interesting thing going on with Serbia and with the former Yugoslavia and these ideas of what independent media could do. That's a little bit of an aside. All right, so I have a chapter on independence, what they mean. I have one of my favorite chapters is on citizenship. Malaysiakini got a big grant from, I guess it was the, there is my friend and angel, Yvonne O. Malaysiakini got a big grant from the Department of State's division. Is it the Division of Human Rights and Labor, the whatever of Human Rights? Bureau of Human Rights, can never keep all that straight, which went through ICFJ, the International Center for Journalists, to fund a citizen journalism project. And I got hired to be the monitor and evaluator, which was great because it meant that I was getting paid to go to Malaysia and to look at Malaysiakini. And so Malaysiakini's idea was to train all of these ordinary people to be journalists. And I think the hope was that they could then become stringers that would help report on the elections. And I was hired to monitor and evaluate this. And the grant was to promote religious tolerance and ethnic understanding. Well, the problem is you couldn't really take a bunch of ordinary Malaysians and give them all, remember flip cameras? That's what they all got. And they were out documenting stuff. But again, those sensitivities, race, religion, ethnicity, they weren't really going to document racial insensitivity or religious intolerance. Instead, they documented things like public parks that needed to be cleaned up, or how ordinary fishermen were being, their livelihood was being taken away by Chinese trawlers that would come in and sweep up all the fish illegally. They did a lot of stuff like that. And so when I was doing monitoring and evaluation for this project, I'm actually pretty good at this. What I realized that I needed to say, okay, look, so no, it didn't really further the goal of religious tolerance and ethnic understanding. What it did do was to take ordinary Malaysians and make them feel like citizens, that it was fascinating. All of these CJs, the citizen journalists, they would tell me things like, before I never felt like a citizen of this country, but now I know I can make a difference. So I actually argued, and this is why I'm a good writer of evaluations, I argued, look, no, it didn't do what the project was supposed to do, but what it did instead was way better. And it's very interesting. A lot of the former CJs ended up doing quite interesting things in their lives after the citizen journalism project was over. So I have a chapter on citizenship. Just on Friday at our symposium on elections, I talked about the May 13th race riot, 1969. And I have a whole chapter on that, which was really interesting. Malaysiakini, this was an interactive feature they did. Fabulous feature. If you Google Malaysiakini May 13th, you'll find it. And even if you don't know a thing about Malaysia, it's worth looking at, and how they documented what happened in this race riot. And they, even now, 50 years later, they still got threats, and it was really awful stuff. So this is a way of looking at how this problem of race, it just hasn't gone away. I have a chapter on religion. It's similar to what I did in my book on journalism in Islam, but this is an interesting picture. This was Malaysiakini got in trouble with the multimedia group because they posted a video of what's known as the Cowhead incident. A group of, I guess there was a Hindu group that wanted to build a temple and, a temple in a majority Malay neighborhood. And the neighbors reacted by taking a cow head, which of course is sacred, and stomping on it. And Malaysiakini had a video of this. Guess who got in trouble? Malaysiakini, not the neighbors who were stomping on a cow head and doing what's clearly an act of religious intolerance. So this would be very typical of the kinds of things that happen in Malaysia. So I have a chapter on religion and then a chapter on politics. This is one of the Bersih rallies. Bersih means clean, and this was the Coalition for Free and Fair Elections. I've actually argued that one of the I hope I'm not offending anybody here, but a lot of the stuff that's been written about Malaysia is pretty boring. And I think one reason is it focuses on elections, and elections in Malaysia don't really change very much. That, there's a whole new cast of characters, but we've still got those same problems of race, religion, and ethnicity. And so in my book, I tried to do something different, not just look at elections, but to look at these problems that just never seem to go away. So in the politics chapter, we have the 14th general election, and that was in 2018. And I was here, and I remember having lunch with Yvonne over at Tonic, and it was just astonishing because for the first time, the Barisan Nasional, the same alliance of the three political parties that had basically controlled everything since independence, were toppled by a somewhat unlikely coalition of Mahathir and Anwar, who was sort of at that point the prime minister in waiting, but not formally. And the interesting thing is that at the time, and those of you who know Malaysia, love Malaysia, will remember with me how infuriating it was. Like Western media, all we could focus on was how old Mahathir was, rather than the fact that the first change in government in 60 years and just how extraordinary this was. So everybody was incredibly optimistic about this, and great things were going to happen. And the promises in their manifesto were that there was going to be increased press freedom. They were going to repeal the Sedition Act. They were going to repeal the Internal Security Act, that's the SASMA is the new name for the old Internal Security Act. And they were going to increase the independence of the state-run media, and they were going to form a media council. Well, then the pandemic came, and then the Sheraton move came. And without going into that, this was a kind of internal thing where Mahathir and Anwar, or Mahathir was kicked out. We had these two guys take over, and nothing happened in terms of media. So this is the next thing I learned, that if you haven't changed the law, you haven't changed anything. And this was really quite a terrible tragedy that, that the Pakatan Harapan came into power. Everybody thought, wow, it's finally the promised land. It's finally going to be better. But they didn't change the law. And, they had a good minister of information. Everybody liked him. I remember, I'm a researcher. I'm not an activist, but I remember asking my friends saying, is anybody like pressuring this guy to, to get the media council going, to really get the law changed? Everybody, oh, there's time. He's a good guy. He's a good guy. Didn't matter. They didn't change the law. Didn't change anything. So where are we now? I guess we sort of have a happy ending. It's at least it was an ending to my book. I at the end of 2022, Stephen and Prem both announced they were retiring. They've both been at Malaysiakini for over 20 years, so that was a kind of ending. And I was basically done with the book. I was still trying to figure out how to end it. Well, surprisingly, all right. So, and I was on sabbatical that year. So I went to Malaysia, watched the general election, and Anwar's party was running, and he did pretty well, but it was a hung parliament. No one party won enough votes. So there were a couple of very strange days while everybody was sort of trying to figure out what would happen next. And then the Agong, the king, appointed Anwar prime minister. So there was a kind of an ending. We start with Mahathir and Anwar, and we end with Mahathir and Anwar. But I think the real happy ending is that Malaysians learned that they can change the government. Right? No, I'm serious. This is huge. This is huge. That it seemed like, first the old Alliance Coalition, then Pakistan Coalition, that these guys would be in power forever. And no, we haven't reached the promised land. Malaysia has not reached the promised land. But there's a big difference that now I think ordinary Malaysians know, look, we have the power to change the government. Nobody has to be in power forever. And so what was the role of Malaysiakini? Well, remember that when Malaysiakini was established in 1999, there was no Facebook. Well, maybe at Harvard, but there was certainly no Facebook that all of us were on. There was no WhatsApp. That Malaysiakini provided a forum where people could express their views. One of the most popular parts of Malaysiakini, and one of the things that always gets them in trouble, are the letters, because um, um, ordinary readers write in with their thoughts. And I was very friendly with a man named Vic Neeson, who for years edited those letters. And that was extremely difficult because he always knew that if they ever got banned, it would be because of something in one of those letters. The journalists were very, very careful about how they wrote things. But when readers would write in, they would, write in all sorts of stuff. So they had to be very careful. And in fact, I remember Vicky said to me that what he always looked for was the valid point, that the writer had to be making a valid point, and Vicky always had it in his head. If they were called in before the authorities, they could say, this is the valid point that is being made. So Malaysiakini provided a forum for people to say what they thought about things. And of course, they had to comply with the rules, no obscenities, and people will sometimes, letter writers will get banned from Malaysiakini because they're constantly using racial insults. Can't do anything like that. But it became this place where people could express their views at a time when there really was not anything else. And in that way, it is very important. So, Stephen and Prem, their goal was to create the kind of Malaysia that they wanted to live in, and they did. I mean, they changed the country. And this is really the last thing I learned, the final thing that I learned, that journalists can change the country. And I really believe that. So let's see. So these are, again, to kind of recap what I've learned, that nobody has to tell journalists what good journalism is, that journalism has a kind of moral economy to it, and that, journalists may not be free to practice what they know, but they understand what it is. It's journalists themselves that have to fight for press freedom, that the best intended public official is not going to do it, because nobody likes being criticized. The journalists have to do it. And again, there was no Alliance of Independent Journalists in Malaysia. So I think that made a difference. As my Malaysian friends know, that the Malaysian press associations they don't do anything. They don't do stuff like that. Journalists should regulate themselves with their own standards of what makes good journalism. The principles of journalism are universal, but how we explain them to ourselves depends on our culture. And I think that's pretty important. One of the things, I have done a lot of speaking as a speaker for the State Department. And one thing that I always emphasize is that in majority Muslim countries, it's not good to talk about press freedom, because freedom is seen as a Western concept. It's seen as, allowing pornography or, cartoons of the prophet. And that's not really, I'm not there to defend pornography. It's not really relevant. What is an Islamic principle is independence, journalistic independence. The best form of jihad is a word of truth to a tyrant. But that's independence. That's independent media. Journalists have to be free to report on the people in power. So yeah, the principles of journalism are universal, but how we explain them to ourselves depends on our culture. You haven't changed the law, you haven't changed anything. Ugh, this is so important. And just to me, the great tragedy of what happened in 2018. And finally, that journalists can change the country. So I think but that's it. My book's available for purchase, University of Chicago Press, and that's the discount code if you want a 20% discount. And I'm so grateful to all of you for coming. And so, thank you. I'm happy to answer questions. And thank you for indulging me as I started off with Princess Diana. I thought that would be
Well, I'll ask.
Okay.
So we've got mics all over.
Janet, thank you so much. It's a fascinating book and a fascinating time period that you've covered. Can you talk a little bit about the kind of journalism that the journalists at Malaysiakini were doing in this period,
Sure.
given that they were constrained by what they could say and do and cover?
There were some similarities to the way that I saw that Tempo covered things under Suharto. That, for example, it is easier to report on something once it is being, once there's a trial, once there's a court case. For example, there are lots of incidents. The term they use is body snatching. Let's say a Muslim boy and a Hindu girl get married, and the Hindu girl, of course, converts because she has to, and then maybe they live happily for a while, and then maybe they get divorced, and then she dies, and she needs to be buried as a Muslim. Well, except she's really Hindu. She didn't really convert. And so then there's body snatching and, then burial according, or cremation according to Hindu customs. Well, you can't just write about that. You can't just write about that. However, if there's a court case, you can write about that. So that was one strategy that they used a lot. The May 13th piece where they went back and looked at what happened in this race riot, there they relied on something else I saw that Tempo used to do, which was that they used kind of a bare bones chronology. They used facts that could be verified, everybody could agree upon. And it seemed, I mean, we all know the choice of what you're going to put in the chronology is a subjective decision, but it somehow looks more factual because it's a chronology and it's all facts. So they did things like that. They're still very careful. I mean, there are things that they can't do. And they were worried about my book, honestly, and I was worried about it. Was I going to include something that would be defamatory? I actually, it's not a secret, the friend who used to edit the letters, I had him read the manuscript before, because I just thought, the last thing I want to do is to have Stephen or Prem end up in jail because I wrote my book on Malaysiakini. So they're still very careful. It's not, how do I put this? For the years that I was writing about it, it was mostly a newspaper online. They didn't really take advantage of the internet in the way, having interactive features, using all of the special affordances of the internet. They didn't really do that. Now they do it now. They have a special reports team, which is incredible, that does all kinds of really interesting interactive features. But this is a relatively new development. They were pretty much straightforward, just reporting on things that the mainstream media were not reporting on. And, one thing that I left out, I probably should have said, is that, after Anwar was, after he was arrested and then accused of all kinds of horrible things and in jail, nobody was reporting on him. And, but Malaysiakini did. And, so they were always quite brave and just reporting on the opposition that would be completely shut out of the mainstream press. When I blasted through those slides, I showed who owns the media in Malaysia, and they weren't going to report on Anwar's party. They were, and which was at that point run by his wife, Wan Aziza, but Malaysiakini would. So they would just do regular news, but in a really corrupted environment, it looked like it was oppositional. So they're always being accused of being opposition media, even though after Pakatan Harapan won in 2018, then, a lot of those people were mad because Malaysiakini was reporting critically about them too, that they've always been accused of being opposition media simply because they reported on the opposition at a time when the mainstream media would not. I think that was a good question because it was a big thing I left out, so which I should have said. Thank you. You first and then you second.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. One of the things that strikes me is watching coverage of the treatment of Muslims in China, in Malaysia. And I actually found an article about a Quran being burned in Alabama by some crazy pastor. But the hundreds of thousands of copies of Quran that were bulldozed by the Chinese government didn't get a squeak. And so I need to understand why Malaysian media, and I've looked at both government connected and independent media, you hear nothing but crickets when it comes to China's treatment of Muslims. And if they knew, I think Malaysians would be riding on the street, burning down the Chinese embassy and hunting Chinese diplomats for lunch.
That may be your answer.
But instead, there's nothing, and not even a little bit, unless they pick it up third hand from the New York Times or the London Times or something like that. I need to understand what the Chinese are doing to control Malaysian media, or what the self-censorship is here that allows the atrocity to carry on.
Well, I think you actually did answer your own question. I think it has to do with the Malaysian government's relations with China, that certainly the state-controlled media isn't going to do anything to ruffle this sort of uneasy situation. And Malaysiakini tends to focus on domestic stuff. They don't have a lot of international news. And that's not really a good answer to your question. I don't really have a better one, though. I mean, Yvonne, what do you think? Why Yvonne, this is Yvonne O, who is now like program coordinator extraordinaire for 4 programs, but she's also the former U.S. Embassy press specialist. And I bet you would get asked this question. I would defer to you.
Yeah. Right. I think there are nuances to this to be able to answer your question, but it's primarily to do with race, religion, and politics as practiced in Malaysia, as well as the economic relationship that the country has with China. Because, as you know, the population balance, I'm sure Janet's covered this, is Malay Muslim majority. And while the Chinese who in northern China are Muslims, there's also that, it's difficult to describe, but that very tolerated relationship between the races, Chinese and Malay in Malaysia. So I think to show that solidarity with the Muslim population in northern China is to sort of confuse that relationship in Malaysia. And politics has to run smooth. If politics are defined by race and religion, that's how they're going to keep it. We don't want to think too hard because people will sort of swap alliances, perhaps.
So the Rohingya create a similar problem.
That's correct.
That, you would think, wow, these are Muslims, and why is not Malaysia embracing them with open arms? But that's also problematic because they're not Malay. They're be seen as, ethnic Indian. So, yeah, I mean, this is what I mean by these intractable problems. It just don't ever go away in Malaysia, and everything is seen through these lenses. And so to even try to get outside of that lens is very difficult. Plus, I do think that I think Malaysian media, sort of like American media, is kind of insular. It's focused on itself. That I just don't think there's that much interest in China, period, and what's really going on in it. And for some of the reasons Yvonne said, I mean, I agree with you. It's an interesting problem, but yeah, Chinese Muslims, well, that's confusing. We don't want to it's actually really quite patronizing, the idea that somehow Malay Muslims are so easily confused that you certainly don't want to mention the Uyghurs, or because the next thing you know, everybody might be wishing each other Merry Christmas or something and forgetting who they really are. So it's for such a lovely country, there's a lot of kind of poisonous stuff that goes on there. And it's not a good answer. I'm sorry. And you had a question. Hopefully it's one I can answer.
Thank you so much. My name is Arifa. You had this slide that journalists themselves have to fight for press freedom. So I think if you can explain it a little bit more, because this is a very difficult thing, that journalists are very divided, mostly between government agencies in such places. So how can they fight for the freedom? It's easy to say. So how do you see this? This is my question.
I guess I see it as sort of the negative side of it, that if journalists don't organize themselves, if they don't push for independent media, press freedom, no one else is going to. That certainly in countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, I suspect Pakistan too, young people in school are not learning that independent media is a civil right, that it's something we deserve. We need to be able to have freedom of expression. We need to be able to write and say and think what we want. Nobody is saying that. You don't learn that in school. So how is anybody going to learn it? I remember after the transition in Indonesia, and I was so grateful to my friends, the diplomats who are here, who invited me to get to come back and be a speaker there frequently, that, you know, I would just say journalists have to be out there. They have to, you know, in Indonesia, there was expression, abri masuk desa, the army enters the villages. Well, I would say wartawan harus masuk sekolah. Journalists have to enter the schools. Journalists need to go and actually talk to people and get out there and explain, you know, that independent media is not just for them, it's for everybody. And I think even in this country, you often hear it's like, it's journalist press freedom, you know, it's like this luxury they have. It's something we all enjoy and benefit from, but it's not like you're born knowing that. And journalists know it. Often the problem is they're more interested in bread and butter issues. I think this is an issue in Malaysia, that being a journalist has traditionally been a pretty comfy job. And why rock the boat? You know, now being a journalist is not a comfy job for anybody anymore. So, you know, there may be more boat rocking going on. But that's why I actually started with the banning of tempo, because I think it was as if the regular army joined the guerrillas, that all of these people who had been pretty comfortable in Indonesia suddenly, you know, were out there in the front lines. And that did make a huge difference. And I've seen at various times in Malaysia, I thought maybe there was a turning point when the publication The Edge was banned. A whole bunch of young journalists got together and organized, and I thought maybe this is it. And there were people from mainstream media, but that kind of blew over. It just never really happened. And without that pressure, there's nobody else who's going to be doing it. Yes.
I'm Julia Shanblock with the U.S. China Education Trust, and we're just down the hall. I wonder if you could comment a bit more about race relations in Malaysia, because I was there on May 13th, 1969,
Really?
in Kuala Lumpur.
Oh my goodness.
I was working.
Tell us about what
I was working for the Peace Corps then, and because I'm Chinese American, but in a riot,
Right.
they're not going to tell that I'm American
Checking
and
your
not
ID.
Chinese.
Yeah.
So the Peace Corps wrapped me up in a rug. I mean, we were incommunicado for 5 days, wrapped me up in a rug and smuggled me out from the airport. So I was not really clear how the press covered those events. All I recall was that they explained it not in racism,
Right.
about racism terms. They said that the public ran amok.
Right.
And, you know, they hacked people to death because they ran amok. I just wonder how media in Malaysia, have they changed in the way they cover these kinds of issues about race? Because it's a poison
Yeah,
in the Malaysian
agree.
society.
I agree. And what a story you have. I actually have a chapter on May 13th, and just on Friday when we had our symposium on elections and cultural and linguistics and historical approaches, I talked about this exclusively. What happened was that the Chinese dominated opposition party, the DAP, which is related to the PAP in Singapore, had unexpected gains. And the Malay parties had unexpected losses. And the Chinese parties celebrated, which was seen as provocative. And there are widely differing views of what actually happened. This is something that pretty much everybody agrees upon. There are views that say that the whole thing was engineered by Malay ultras in order to topple the then Prime Minister and then create a new Malay capitalist class. And one thing that did happen was the new economic policy, which benefited rural Malays, and it was sort of a Operation Bootstraps for rural Malays. It brought ultimately Mahathir to power. It created the Rukun Negara, which was the state ideology, which was like the Pledge of Allegiance. A whole lot of things happened as a result of this. And the talk I gave on Friday, which is also in the book, it's very interesting to me that Malaysians always use the term specter or ghost of May 13th. And I think that's such a fascinating term, because a ghost, as a Malay friend said to me, a ghost is something that you'd really better not talk about, especially if you feel its presence. And so every time there is an election, there's always the fear that if the Chinese-backed parties, or basically the non-Malay parties, do too well, there will be another race riot. And at every single general election, and this is in my book, and I talked about this on Friday, at every single general election, that ghost reemerges, including this last one. I mean, always. Apalagi China Mao, what else do the Chinese want? There is just this fear that the, Chinese dominated parties are somehow going to get more power, then it's a zero-sum game, take it away from the Malays, and there will be riots. So it's this, I mean, it is a poisonous thing. It is a poisonous thing. And so it was fascinating. I was really proud of Malaysiakini for trying to deal with this. And it's definitely worth looking at that interactive feature, because it's very, very interesting. They go through the whole thing, but the stuff they left out was very interesting too. And the stuff that they only published in English was very interesting. They didn't publish in Malay was interesting. And so it's a fascinating story, but there's still this fear. What's going to happen? Yes.
Thank you. My name is Neha. This is a general question. Government of any country has all the power. Do you think independent media is really independent, which can report anything and everything happening which is immoral or which should be reported? And second question is, do Malaysiakini still have barriers or restrictions even though they are independent? Because ultimately government is more powerful.
Sure.
Even though speaking truth is more powerful ideally, but we are not living in an ideal world as we know so far. Thank you.
I think, yeah, there's no perfect media system and there's no perfect society. But to me, the fundamental principle is that journalists should be free to report on those in power. They should be independent of those in power, and they should be able to report on those in power. And, each culture has its own sort of internal rules of what is appropriate and what isn't appropriate. One of the things that to me is so interesting about what's happened in the United States with the Trump administration was that they didn't follow the rules that everybody had always followed. So there's a lot of rules that are unspoken, unwritten. Everybody just assumes that we're going to follow those rules, in this country and every country. So, how countries figure out they're going to do things, it just depends on culture. But still, to me, a fundamental principle is journalists should be independent of those in power, and they should be free to report on those in power, and how they choose to do it is sort of up to them. And yes, there's still certainly things that Malaysiakini is very cautious of. And yes, they could get banned. Probably rather than getting outright banned, defamation is a bigger concern, because, and there are a couple of incidents, I wrote about them in the book, where actually a comment in a, readers can write comments, a comment in the story was viewed as defamatory, and Malaysiakini was, faced huge fines because of this. They were found guilty and they faced huge fines, but the readers raised all this money to cover the fines. It was really quite extraordinary. So yeah, there's still lots of things they have to be very careful about. So no, it's not perfect. But I just admire how they just keep struggling. They really, for years and years, were just like Sisyphus. They just kept, and nothing seemed to change. Which again, I decided was the story, that's Malaysia for you, that there are these problems that don't go away. Maybe get marginally better, but don't really go away. Sylvia.
Thank you. Sylvia Waysmore, SMPA. As I listen to you, Janet, I'm trying to find sort of what is the main takeaway, what explains the survival, the viability of Malaysiakini. And listen to you, I hear that basically what you emphasize time and time again is how astute they have been in trying to figure out what are the limitations, what are the rules of the political game in the country, and how they can manage that to the best of their abilities. Are there other factors? I mean, if you were to summarize, especially for people interested in promotion of press freedom or press independence in similar contexts where the constraints, the political, economic, cultural constraints are so obvious, what would be the takeaway besides having editors who are like very good and very knowledgeable in trying to navigate these very complicated waters? Other economic reasons, political reasons, anything else that will explain the longevity of Malaysiakini?
Oh, that's a great question. Do you have an answer to this? Do you know?
I don't, but I mean, I will look at, whether the economic model
Right.
was different and viable and pioneer, whether or not within the political conditions offer some room yet limited for the kind of journalism they practice, meaning it's more a combination of both agency and structure. So the agency is how smart they are in trying to sort of figure out what is the best way to position the reporting and the organization within the political, economic, and cultural constraints.
It's like, how does Rappler do it? And
Right. Or the other organizations. I mean, you have been interested in similar organizations in other countries, in Indonesia and Serbia.
right.
So, I mean, that to me is a common interest, not just that you have, but basically, or if you think about other countries,
Right.
what are the insights?
Right.
know.
And I don't know. I mean, I guess now I know about two countries extremely well, Indonesia and Malaysia, and these journalists who managed to do that. And then also we all know the story of Rappler and Maria Ressa and what she's doing. And then, I become interested in Serbia and Radio B92 and what they did. The interesting thing is they all seem to have had a kind of moment when everything came together and it worked. And I think sadly there's probably also, kind of natural life to them. And I hope that Malaysiakini will go on forever, but in a way, they are a victim of their own success because they have managed to open up the country. The Star is a much better paper now than it used to be. I remember it used to just be full of ads and just nonsense about the government, and it's not anymore. It's a pretty good paper that I think that the whole system has opened up. So there is something about a unique historical moment, and then maybe, just these individuals who see this opportunity and somehow understand what needs to be done. I don't really know. I wish there were a formula because it'd be great. We could use it in a lot of countries. I've seen it happen, but I think it's, it's Verin Matic in Serbia. It's Stephen and Prem in Malaysia. It's Anwar Muhammad and Fikri Jufri in Indonesia. It's Maria Ressa in the Philippines. Where do they come from? How do they figure this out? But I also think that, sadly, and I don't know who's listening online, but it may be that the Malaysiakini's moment may actually not be over. They're still fighting, lots to fight, but I think I think the country did change because of what they did. And and of course the other way it could end is that someone could end up in jail and that's the end of it. So yeah, I don't know. It's a great question and I don't know the answer to that. Yes. Oh, do we have online questions? No online questions. Then go ahead.
Check. Ashwini Tambe, Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies and History, but my question really comes from my experience. I spent my childhood in Malaysia and still keep in touch with my friends. And I really appreciate your use of the word ghost and haunting because that is exactly how I experienced the way people around me spoke about 1969 as I was growing up. Barely anything actually said about it, but constant avoidance. The thing that I've noticed that has changed with my school friends group, we're actually on WhatsApp and we've been communicating before that Facebook. So I've been watching how they talk about race over the last 15 years. And I've really been struck by a much greater openness and particularly in WhatsApp circles. And so I think the 2018, change could be also attributed to the rise of social media platforms. And so I was curious about whether your book engages that question about, what is the relationship between Malaysiakini and this changing social media environment, where they have to also appeal to a certain kind of thirst or hunger for, really, a kind of a constant scaling up of what is newsworthy.
Right. I don't write about that. I'm interested in Malaysiakini, and there's certainly other communication scholars who've written about social media and its effects on Malaysian politics. Ross Tapsell from ANU in Australia, he's written a lot about social media. Malaysiakini was really pre-social media. That's the interesting thing, that they were able to do through their letters and their forums a lot of things that now we see on WhatsApp. Now they've also adapted. One of the things, it did take me 15 years to write this book because I couldn't figure out what the story was, honestly. And I just kept going back and watching them and going to their retreats and their editorial meetings and trying to figure out what is the story here. And, watching them deal with the rise of social media and use the rise of, but they were not really pioneers in, yes, they've got a Facebook presence and they've got a WhatsApp presence and they're on Twitter, but they were sort of following others in that regard. So I don't think that they were really pioneers in that way, but everything they did was pioneering in terms of having this creating this community. And their citizen journalism program was really quite innovative too, although not for the reasons the State Department was funding it. So that was interesting. Yes.
I think this is related. I'm Madeline Ross, U.S. China Education Trust. I'm just trying to get a sense of how vibrant is the independent press in Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, because the examples you've given are of a dominant outlet and very dynamic leaders. Are there others who are trying to compete in that space with these?
Yeah, I mean, Malaysiakini had a lot of imitators, but the interesting thing, and I have this in my chapter on independence, their ownership is shadowy. We don't know who owns them, and they kind of come and go. And we all suspect that certain politicians, they fund this one that right now looks very independent. It's not really independent. It's just anti-government. And operated in the interest of some other politician. So Malaysiakini is unusual in that it is truly independent of any political faction, because there are others that imitate it and look independent but really aren't. I would not say that the media in Malaysia are especially vibrant at this point. Indonesia is still way ahead in those terms. And here I tend to disagree with my colleague Russ Tapsell, who he's very concerned about ownership of publications in Indonesia, because they're, openly connected with political factions. However, in Indonesia, we all know who's behind what publication. So you just don't read this one if we know that Suryo Paloh owns Media Indonesia. So therefore, we're going to be a little skeptical of how it covers his party. Or we know Abu Rizal Bakri owns TV1. So we'll be a little skeptical of how TV1 covers Bakri. So I think I would say that Indonesia has way more vibrant media than Malaysia does right now. I mean, vibrant media, how are our media vibrant? You kind of wonder what's happening in the US. I feel like that's been an interesting thing too in my 25 years of writing and talking and visiting Southeast Asia, that I'm a lot less certain about what the ideal model is than I used to be, because our model is having a lot of problems. So that's perhaps another discussion. Yes.
Hi, I'm Tappy. I'm from the
Hi.
SMPA and the Elliott School. Following up on your brief comments about how Malaysiakini sometimes covers articles in Malay and then doesn't translate them into English, or vice versa, and then for the other languages, how would you say that Malaysiakini sees its role in mediating the racial and religious cleavages in Malaysia? Does it prioritize keeping harmony among the different religions and races, or forthright reporting and accurate reporting and
Great
reflection
question.
reflections?
Great question. Yeah, harmony is such a ick word. Harmony usually means like, don't discuss it. Let's all just, Asia, Malaysia, truly Asia. We're all just so harmonious. The Malaysiakini is quite, they are different. Every news organization, yes, has Malays and Indians and Chinese Malaysians. Every news organization does. Malaysiakini consciously tries to create an environment of mutual respect. They really do. Everybody's on the same floor. They do share the same stories. And I don't want to make it sound as if routinely they covered very different things. They don't. Their stories, I mean, they translate stuff, like I see the stories for, I guess, I don't know if there are any Malaysiakinians listening, but I have had access to their internal emails for the last 15 years. So now they all communicate on WhatsApp, so the emails aren't that interesting anymore. But I used to watch everything in real time get passed from one desk to the other. May 13th was kind of an exception. They're reporting on May 13th, and the stories that they thought were dangerous there was one in particular. It was by a Malay man who recounted watching a Chinese delivery boy being murdered, and then him personally saving a Chinese family in a car. And it's graphic what he said, and that was in English, and that one was not translated into Malay. And I asked about that, and Stephen said it's up to each desk editor to decide which of the stories they wanted to have in their language. And that was a case where I think probably had they had that story, that would have created such an uproar that they might have been. There were police reports about their May 13th story. I asked one of the editors, Idila, I said, were you worried about the police? And she said, we probably should have been more worried that they really weren't. But there were 4 police reports about their story, and then they were all dropped. But so, yeah, there's still real threats of doing something that could disturb racial harmony. And that would be one of them. So I don't want to make it sound, first of all, Malaysiakini is not a utopia, but they really do try. I mean, they really do try to create this environment of real mutual respect. But there are still some things they have to be very careful about. They don't want to get banned or end up in jail. But that's a really good question. There are still lines, and everybody knows what they are. And to have a Malay man talk about, acknowledging murdering a Chinese delivery man, that could just be, the May 13th story is just a great story. You have to look at it. Had 2 editors, Idila Razak, who is Malay, and then Sin Hao who is Chinese Malaysian. And Sin Hao was really attacked on social media, called a Chinese pig and, Babi communist pig. So it's bare knuckle politics in Malaysia. So, Malaysiakini isn't perfect, but they really do try. And this is their policy to do this. So, good question. Yes, thanks.
Hi, I'm Camilla Bailey from Radio Free Asia, and you touched on the fact that press freedom is not guaranteed, not something to be taken for granted, and has arguably shifted a little bit in the last decade. If you had to pick 1 or 2 big lessons for American press to take from Malaysiakini's journey, could you give a couple recommendations?
To be grateful for what we have, and I think, my diplomatic friends who've been in countries with authoritarian regimes, that Americans so take for granted independent media, press freedom. I mean, here we're allowed to say press freedom. We take it for granted. And it's something that's so extraordinary. And when I've seen people who are, willing to go to jail for these principles and willing to risk everything, it's, it's really extraordinary. And sometimes I just wish I could take my fellow Americans and just shake them and say, look what you've got. Don't throw this away. Don't squander this over something stupid. These journalists are my heroes. And this is, I feel so strongly about this. And one thing that I actually love getting to speak in other countries to journalism students and young journalists. I feel like we're not often enough cheerleaders for good journalism. We should be, because I really do think that journalism is the most noble profession there is. What else is better than bringing truthful information to the public so they can make good decisions? And that's why for me it was just shocking, the idea that journalists are the enemies of the American people. You've got to be kidding, that this is, we all know journalists who've been in jail for these principles. So, yes, that to me is the most important thing. I mean, journalists their job is to bring truthful information to the citizens so they can make good decisions. And what could be more noble than that? I really believe that. And I have lots of examples from around the world that I like to be able to show. Look, this is what people did. These guys, these two ordinary guys, Stephen and Prem, they're humble, just normal guys. They changed the country. I really think that. And, it's kind of amazing. Maybe that's a good place to end. It's almost. I'm so grateful to all of you for coming. To Alyssa, thank you for your introduction. All of my friends from all over the place. I'm really grateful. Thank you so much.